Part 1, First Contact in the Forest. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Dr. Thaddeus Harrison's boots as he approached the research cabin. Steam rose from his coffee mug, swirling in the crisp morning air. As Earth's leading expert on human behavioral patterns, he'd hosted many visiting researchers, but today's guest was unlike any other. Fascinating thermal regulation technique, came a melodic voice from the porch. HFY sat perfectly still, their iridescent exoskeleton reflecting the golden sunrise. The alien anthropologist's four compound eyes tracked the steam from Thaddeus's mug with evident interest. Just coffee, Thaddeus smiled, settling into the handcrafted cedar chair beside them. Though I suppose even that says something about us humans and our habits. Indeed. HFY's antenna twitched thoughtfully. Your species seeks isolation in these wooden structures scattered across your wilderness areas. Yet you bring elements of your civilization with you, processed beverages, climate control, preserved foods. The contradiction intrigues us. Thaddeus watched a deer emerge from the tree-line, its breath visible in the cool air. That's exactly why I suggested we conduct our cultural exchange here, rather than at the university. To understand humanity's relationship with cabin retreats, you need to experience one firsthand. Our preliminary data shows a 47% increase in cabin bookings over the past decade, HFY noted, pulling up holographic charts with a gesture of their lower appendage. Despite advances in virtual reality and urban comfort technologies, it defies logical progression. Logic isn't always the driving force behind human behavior, Thaddeus chuckled. These cabins represent something deeper than just shelter or recreation. A branch snapped in the forest, drawing both their attention. The deer bounded away, white tail flashing. HFY's exoskeleton shifted to match the weathered gray of the cabin walls, a subtle sign of their species' instinctive camouflage response. You see? Thaddeus gestured to their reaction. Even advanced beings like yourself retain connections to your evolutionary past. Humans are no different. These cabins let us reconnect with something primitive and essential in our nature. Yet you choose this primitive experience voluntarily, HFY observed. Our research shows humans spending considerable resources to temporarily reduce their comfort and technological access. The behavior pattern appears across all social classes and cultures. Thaddeus stood, walking to the porch railing. The morning sun painted the forest in shades of amber and gold. Follow me. I want to show you something. He led the alien researcher down a narrow trail behind the cabin. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm, punctuated by birdsong and the rustle of leaves. After several minutes, they emerged at a small clearing. A cluster of stone foundations lay half buried in the earth, nearly consumed by moss and vegetation. These are the remains of a settlement from the 1800s, Thaddeus explained. A family built their home here, lived off the land. Today, their descendants probably live in climate-controlled apartments and order groceries through their smartphones. But something keeps drawing us back to places like this. HFY's antenna quivered with interest as they scanned the ruins. A form of cultural memory? More than that. It's in our DNA. For most of human history, this was home, the edge of wilderness, shelter we built with our own hands, the delicate balance between civilization and nature. Modern cabins let us step back into that space, even if just for a little while. The alien researcher produced a small device, recording various measurements of the site. Your species continues to puzzle us, Dr. Harrison. You push constantly toward the future, yet remain anchored to your past. Maybe that's not a contradiction, Thaddeus smiled. Maybe it's exactly what makes us human. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the old settlement, HFY documenting every detail while Thaddeus shared stories passed down about the family who once lived there. As the sun climbed higher, they returned to the cabin. The alien researcher's exoskeleton had taken on a slight wood-grain pattern, unconsciously mimicking their surroundings. "I believe I'm beginning to understand," Nix, for 27 said as they settled back onto the porch. "These cabins serve as more than simple retreats. They are bridges between your species' past and present." Thaddeus nodded, pouring another cup of coffee. "And everyone who stays in one adds their own story to that bridge. Speaking of which, I should show you the guest book inside. Some of the entries might surprise you." Part 2, Patterns in Solitude. Commander Reese Blackwood hadn't planned on sharing his story with an alien anthropologist, but here he was, warming his hands by the cabin's stone fireplace while Nix 427's compound eyes reflected the dancing flames. "Military personnel represent 23% of regular cabin users in your region," the alien researcher noted, their antenna swaying gently. "A statistically significant pattern." "Doesn't surprise me," Reese replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "After 15 years of active duty, places like this became my sanctuary. Dr. Harrison asked me to speak with you about it." Thaddeus sat quietly in the corner, letting his old friend take the lead. The cabin's interior was simple, all wooden walls and handmade furniture, with a few military photos on the mantel catching the firelight. "When you spend months in sterile bases or metal ships," Reese continued, "you start craving something real. Something that reminds you of what you're protecting in the first place." Nix 427's exoskeleton shifted to a deeper shade, matching the cabin's warm tones. "Our data shows increased cabin usage following deployment periods. Yet these structures lack many basic security features." A smile crossed Reese's weathered face. "That's exactly the point. We spend our careers analyzing threats, maintaining vigilance. But here." He gestured to the window, where snow had begun falling softly through the pines. "Here, we can finally let our guard down." "Counterintuitive," Nix 427 observed. "Choosing vulnerability as a means of recovery. I remember my first cabin stay after returning from the Meridian conflict," Reese said, his voice growing softer. "Couldn't sleep in my apartment, too many cars, too many people. But that first night in the woods, listening to nothing but owl calls and creaking timber. I slept straight through till morning." Thaddeus leaned forward. "Tell them about the program you started." "Right," Reese nodded. 5 years ago, I began organizing cabin retreats for veterans. No schedules, no therapy sessions, just time in the wilderness. Some folks come to heal, others to remember, some just to breathe." Nix 427 produced their holographic display, adding notes. "And the success rate? Can't really measure it in numbers," Reese said. "But I've seen the changes. There's something about chopping your own firewood, cooking over a flame, watching the stars wheel overhead, reminds you that you're part of something bigger than war." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing upward. Outside, the snow was falling harder, creating a soft blanket of white across the landscape. "One of our recent participants, Lieutenant Park, hadn't spoken more than 2 words since returning home," Reese continued. "Third night at the cabin, we found her on the porch at dawn, telling stories about her grandfather's farm. Something about this place, it unlocks what's been buried." Nix 427's antenna twitched with interest. "A form of environmental therapy?" "More like remembering who we are beneath the uniforms," Reese replied. "Humans weren't made for concrete and steel. Out here, you can't help but reconnect with something more fundamental." He stood, walking to the window. The snow had transformed the forest into a quiet wonderland. "Take this weather, for instance. In the city, it's an inconvenience, traffic jams, delayed flights. But here? It's a reminder of nature's power and beauty. Makes you feel small in the best possible way. Your species seeks both mastery over nature and submission to it," Nix 427 observed. "A fascinating duality. Maybe that's what these cabins represent, Thaddeus interjected. A balance point between those impulses. Reese nodded slowly. I've seen hardened soldiers cry watching a sunset from a cabin porch. Seen trauma survivors find peace in splitting logs. There's healing in these simple acts, in this return to basics. And the isolation? Nix 427 queried. Our studies show humans are primarily social creatures. Sometimes you need space from humanity to remember your humanity, Reese smiled. These cabins, they're like pressure release valves for the soul. Especially for those of us who've seen the darker side of what humans can do. The fire crackled softly, filling the thoughtful silence. Outside, a deer moved ghost-like through the snowy trees, pausing to look toward the warm windows before disappearing into the white curtain of falling snow. Would you like to see our guest books? Reese asked finally. Every veteran who stays here leaves a message. Some are funny, some will break your heart, but together they tell a story about healing and hope. Nix 427's exoskeleton rippled with interest. Yes, please. These personal narratives provide valuable context for our research. As Reese retrieved the worn books from a shelf, Thaddeus caught his eye and nodded. They both knew that some truths about humanity could only be understood through individual stories, through the quiet moments in places like this where people rediscovered themselves among the trees. The snow continued falling outside, wrapping the cabin in a peaceful silence that seemed to speak volumes about why humans would always seek such refuges in the wilderness. Part 3, Digital Detox. Juniper Wells, CEO of one of the world's largest tech companies, stood in her cabin's doorway watching Nix 427 examine the conspicuous lack of technology in her retreat. The alien researcher's antenna twitched with evident confusion at the sight of actual paper books lining wooden shelves. Let me understand, Nix 427 said, their exoskeleton shifting to match the cabin's rustic interior. You create devices that connect humans globally, yet you spend 30 days annually in this structure specifically to avoid those connections? Ironic, isn't it? Juniper laughed, tucking a strand of silver-streaked black hair behind her ear. I spend my life making it impossible for people to disconnect, then come here to do exactly that. Dr. Harrison sat at the hand-carved table, taking notes. This interview had been particularly difficult to arrange. Juniper Wells was known for guarding her privacy fiercely, especially during her cabin retreats. Observe the deliberate technological regression, Nix 427 noted, gesturing to the wood-burning stove and manual coffee grinder. Even basic tasks are chosen to be performed without automation. That's the whole point, Juniper said, grinding coffee beans with practiced motions. In my normal life, algorithms predict my needs before I know them. AI manages my schedule. Computers mediate every human interaction. But here. She inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh coffee scent. Here, I remember what it means to do things with my own hands. The morning light filtered through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. Outside, a small vegetable garden showed signs of careful tending. Your company's mission statement emphasizes constant connectivity as essential to modern human existence, Nix 427 observed. Yet you advocate for periodic disconnection. Juniper moved to the stove, heating water in a battered kettle. Understanding the value of disconnection makes me better at creating connection. People aren't meant to be on all the time. We need fallow periods, just like fields need to lie fallow to restore fertility. An agricultural metaphor from a technology leader, Thaddeus noted with a smile. My grandfather was a farmer, Juniper said, watching the kettle. He taught me that everything worthwhile requires patience and personal involvement. Silicon Valley runs on instant gratification, but nature. She gestured to the garden. Nature can't be rushed. Nix 427's compound eyes tracked a bee moving between flowering herbs by the window. Yet many humans experience anxiety when separated from their devices. Of course they do, Juniper nodded. We've engineered that response. The average person checks their phone 3-4 times per day. Our algorithms are designed to create dependence. She poured the hot water over the ground coffee in careful circles. That's exactly why places like this are essential. A counterbalance? Thaddeus suggested. More like an antidote, Juniper replied. The first few days are always the hardest. Your brain keeps reaching for that dopamine hit from notifications. But gradually, you start noticing things. The way light changes through the day. The different songs birds sing at dawn versus dusk. Your own thoughts, without constant digital interruption. She handed cups of coffee to her guests, the rich aroma filling the cabin. Nick's 427's antenna waved appreciatively, though they couldn't drink it. Our research indicates increasing cabin bookings among technology sector workers, the alien researcher noted. Is this a widespread recognition of the phenomenon you describe? We're all burning out, Juniper said simply. Creating systems that demand constant human attention while being fundamentally inhuman themselves. These cabins. She ran her hand along the rough-hewn wall. They remind us what it means to be flesh and blood, to exist in real space and time. A smartphone lay on a shelf, powered down and covered in dust, a sort of technological memento mori. Juniper caught Nick's 427 studying it. I keep it there as a reminder, she explained. In my regular life, that device is practically grafted to my hand. Here, it's just an object, no more important than a rock or a stick. The world doesn't end when we unplug. If anything, it expands. The morning light had strengthened, illuminating the garden where butterflies now danced between herbs and vegetables. Juniper's movements in the cabin were unhurried, almost meditative. The greatest luxury today isn't connectivity, she continued. It's the ability to disconnect. To be fully present in one moment, one place. These cabins aren't about rejecting technology, they're about remembering that we're more than our digital extensions. Nick's 427's exoskeleton had taken on a subtle pattern matching the wood grain of the walls. Your perspective challenges our assumptions about human progress. Progress isn't always about adding things, Juniper smiled. Sometimes it's about knowing what to subtract, and when. That's the wisdom these places teach us. Part 4, The Ancestral Pull. Professor Autumn Nakamura knelt by the cabin's herb garden, her hands deep in the rich soil as Nick's 427 recorded her explanation of humanity's biological connection to forest environments. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, and somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped out its rhythmic code. Your neural scans show marked changes in human brain activity within forested settings, Nick's 427 observed, their exoskeleton shifting to match the dappled sunlight. Particularly in structures like this cabin. It's not surprising, Autumn replied, gently transplanting a young rosemary plant. For roughly 300,000 years, this was our natural habitat, the edge of woodlands, near fresh water, with shelter we constructed ourselves. Our brains evolved in this context. Dr. Harrison watched from the cabin's porch, noting how the alien researchers' usually precise movements had become more fluid during their extended stay in the forest environment. Yet your species deliberately moved away from these conditions, Nick's 427 pointed out. Creating artificial environments that bear little resemblance to this setting. Autumn stood, brushing soil from her hands. That's precisely why we're drawn back here. Our bodies and minds still respond to these environmental cues, even if we don't consciously recognize them. She led them to a clearing where late sunlight filtered through the canopy. Look up at that light pattern. The way it moves, the color spectrum filtered through leaves, it triggers the release of specific neurotransmitters in our brains. We're literally wired to find it calming. Fascinating, Nick's 427's antenna quivered. A physiological response to environmental factors your ancestors would have associated with safety and resources. Exactly, Autumn nodded. The sound of moving water, the smell of pine needles, even the beneficial bacteria in forest soil, they all speak to something deep in our cellular memory. These cabins let us immerse ourselves in that ancestral environment while maintaining some modern comforts. A breeze stirred the trees, sending a wave of shadow and light across the clearing. Autumn closed her eyes, feeling the air on her face. Our research indicates humans sleep more deeply in cabin settings, Nix, 427 noted. Average REM cycles increase by 27%. Makes sense, Autumn smiled. These environments signal safety to our primitive brain. No artificial lights, no urban noise pollution, just the sounds and smells our species evolved with. Plus, exposure to natural light cycles helps regulate our circadian rhythms. They walked back toward the cabin as the sun began to set. Fireflies were emerging, their gentle lights dancing between the trees. Consider these fireflies, Autumn gestured. Their bioluminescent patterns occur at specific frequencies that our visual cortex finds inherently pleasing. Not because we learn to appreciate them, but because our ancestors used them as navigation markers on dark nights. Nix 427's compound eyes tracked the insect's movements. Your species appears to carry a profound biological memory. More than we usually acknowledge, Autumn agreed. Studies show that just 20 minutes in a forest setting reduces cortisol levels, lowers blood pressure, and improves immune function. We're literally healthier in these environments. Inside the cabin, shadows lengthened across wooden floors. Autumn lit a few candles, their warm light creating a cozy atmosphere. Even this, she gestured to the flames. The specific wavelength of firelight, the way it flickers, it triggers the production of melatonin, helping us prepare for sleep. Our ancestors gathered around fires for millions of years. That pattern is deeply encoded in our biology. Yet many humans seem unaware of these connections, Nix 427 observed. We've gotten very good at ignoring our body's signals, Autumn sighed. But they're still there, pulling us back to places like this. It's not nostalgia or anti-modern sentiment, it's biology. The fireflies continued their dance outside the windows, their lights reflecting in Nix 427's compound eyes. The alien researchers' exoskeleton had developed subtle patterns that mimicked bark and lichen, a sign of their own species' adaptive responses. Perhaps, Nix 427 suggested, these cabins serve as a form of evolutionary bridge, allowing your species to maintain essential biological connections while advancing technologically. Autumn smiled, watching the night deepen beyond the windows. That's a beautiful way to put it. We can't go back to living in the forest permanently, but we can't fully leave it behind either. These cabins let us honor both parts of our nature.